Hey there, Social Studies 30-1. This is the last lesson. I'm going to teach you just a few more examples today of nonviolent protests, citizens taking action. So we're going to look at Idle No More, the Occupy movement, the Arab Awakening, and a quick look at the Hong Kong protests. But to get going, here we go. Idle No More. It began in around December of 2012. And it was a First Nations driven act of protest. The government had passed what was known as Bill C-45. It did a lot of things, but the basic gist was that um, it took away some of the control of First Nations peoples of their land and their resources. And that's what they were protesting against, the loss of sovereignty for their territory and resources on their territory. And it spawned the Idle No More movement, which was seen across Canada. It was an act of nonviolent protest. First Nations groups and other sympathizers too got together and they shut down, major thoroughfares, traffic routes, rail lines, and things like that. Here you see a picture with a sign saying "Road Closed." The Mohawk Confederacy in Eastern Canada. um, Silence No More. So just the whole title, Idle No More, it conveys the sentiment that we're not going to stand around and take this any longer. We're not just going to let you do this to us. No longer will we be inactive bystanders as the government. Conducts what they would deem to be illiberal acts concerning them and their territory. The idle no more. So, you know, everyone knows that First Nations peoples are a marginalized group in Canada, both economically and politically, and they're going to be idle no more. They're going to seize and take action for their own affairs in their own direction. And so images like that were very common across Canada in 2012 and the spring of 2013. Like I said, major thoroughfares were closed. They shut down railroad lines, and it's I guess an effective way of getting attention. I'm not sure that it gets you the sympathy that you're always looking for, and that, people are late for work, they can't get to work because you're blocking the route. It gets you on the news, it gets you attention. I'm not sure how effective it is in getting sympathy from people. I'm not sure about that. It was even in Calgary. There you see the Peace Bridge in downtown Calgary was part of the Idle No More movement in 2012, 2013. For the most part, they remained peaceful, but there you see, a truck trying to drive through the crowd, not barreling through at 100 miles an hour, but he's trying to inch his way through the crowd to get to work or wherever he's got to go. And some people got hurt, but I don't think they weren't serious injuries, that's for sure. Other active nonviolent protest I wanted to talk about. Oh, by the way, Um, Idle No More, it didn't, I don't know if it brought the change about that people wanted, but then again, you don't measure a protest in terms of it being immediately successful. It might take time. It might take years or decades to get what you want after that initial act of protest. I mean, we talked a bit about Tankman already. He conducted that act in 1989, and China's still not a democracy, but it's sure inspirational for China to one day get a democracy. So I just think that one thing we need to realize with nonviolent protest is that you may not leave the protest itself with what you want. It might take years, even decades, to get what you want, and we need to reckon this too, if at all. You may never get what you want out of the protest, but that doesn't mean that you still shouldn't do it. That doesn't mean that it's not important and that you shouldn't go ahead with it and at least try. Occupy movement, 2011. Your parents would remember this one, I'm sure. This was a protest against, um, well, especially economic, but also social and political inequality. It was in the aftermath of the financial meltdown of 2008. Remember, we watched The Big Short, and how the government had to bail out the banks after, a financial meltdown because of, well, we won't get into that. That's more for the movie. But anyway, After the government bailed the banks out, a slogan was born: "We are the 99%." And the reason why their slogan was "We are the 99% is that in the eyes of this protest, 1% of the world controlled most of the wealth. 1% of the world controlled most of the wealth, big financial corporations, the big banks, corporations, and so on. They controlled the wealth. And as we've learned, when you've got economic power, you've also got political power too. And there's no doubt about that. And so their slogan was, "We are the 99%." In other words, they were protesting that 1% that controlled the wealth, politics, and had power, and so on. They were the 99%. They spoke for the common man, common people. By and large, the protest remained nonviolent. It flared up in some cities. It flared up in New York. The police used tear gas. It flared up in Oakland, California, tear gas and some government police aggression to put down the protesters. They made very good use of social media. This is the era of social media, and you can connect people very, very quick. Just think about how far revolutions and protests have come. If I took you back to 1789, just before the French Revolution, most people couldn't read, they couldn't write, there was certainly no TV, there was no radio, there was no internet, there were no cell phones. It was very hard to bring a group together in protest in 1789, and certainly well into the early 1900s. Again, very hard to bring people together in protest. But now, with the handiness of a cell phone, with things like, Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, and whatever, you can bring people together very quickly and very effectively. This movement lasted for about a year. It created a lot of awareness. It hit the news. It was splashed all over the media, but it didn't have a lasting impact on politics or economics, at least not early on. Did it have a lasting impact on politics or economics? But as we've learned, maybe down the road, this could lead to a redistribution of wealth. What they were after was what is called a Robin Hood tax. We're going to tax the rich more to give to the poor. They didn't get that in the immediate aftermath, but maybe sometime in the future. Here's a map showing you the hotspots for the Occupy movement. So you can see that North America was a big hotspot. I mean, that it was born on the eastern coast of North America, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, a little bit in South America, but by and large, it was a Western protest movement, protesting, what people saw as decadence and the rich controlling the poor and so on. It was actually in Calgary too. There's a picture of downtown Calgary Olympic Square. That's the fall of 2011. And you can see there is quite a few people, and I should talk about Occupy. Occupy itself, all it was protesters peacefully occupied areas of the city. And sometimes they held signs and they marched, but by and large they simply occupied. They squatted. They camped out for weeks, months on end in some cases to raise attention for their cause. Again, they're not committing acts of violence, so they're not really doing anything wrong. You'd look bad as a government if you went in and stopped them. But they did inconvenience a lot of things too. By the winter in Calgary, it had lost a lot of its steam. It's cold, and you're occupying a tent in downtown Calgary, and it just kind of fizzled out in the northern climes. And the police broke the thing up in late fall of 2011 anyway. They'd had enough. They gave them their chance, they gave them their moment, and then they had to clean up the mess. All right, the last one we'll do here, the Arab Spring. Arab Spring. Sometimes it's called the Arab Awakening. This refers to a protest movement that began in 2010 in the Arab world, in the Arabic world, parts of the Middle East. Was started by this gentleman here in Tunisia. of all places. Tunisia is a country in North Africa. You need to understand that a large swath of the Arab world is very undemocratic. It's very authoritarian, dictatorship after dictatorship, and then sometimes even kingdoms like Saudi Arabia. So a lot of political repression. There's not a lot of free speech, and especially very little democracy through large swaths of the Middle East and the Arabic world. Anyway, in Tunisia, in the fall of 2010, Mohammed, a Tunisian farmer, um, he just got sick of the corruption in order for him to conduct his livelihood. He was a farmer, so he would take his produce from his farm and he would sell it at a downtown market, and as he transported his goods to the downtown market, he'd have to bribe a series of guards and a series of policemen because that's just how he had to conduct his business. He'd have to bribe this guard and then bribe this guard and this guard, and one day he comes upon a guard that just won't let him through. The guard says, "No, give me the food. Um, get out of here." Guard was in a bad mood, I guess. I don't know. And anyway, he says, "Well, can I at least keep my wheelbarrow so I can come back tomorrow with my produce?" And the guard says, "No, leave that too and get out of here." So Muhammad comes back to the downtown square later that day, and he's angry. He's fed up. All he's trying to do is put food on the table, and he's got to go through all of these things to be able to do that. Takes a jerry can of gasoline, douses himself, and lights himself on fire. And this was seen, by a lot of people. It was photographed, but it was videotaped, and he became sort of ground zero for the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening. People watched this on TV, they saw the photographs, and they sympathized with him, and they said, "You know what? Time's up. I'm not putting up with this any longer." And so, in country after country in the Arabic world, people by the millions poured onto the streets in non-violent protest. At least they started as nonviolent protest. And then some of them stayed nonviolent. Others percolated and became violent and even led to civil war. The goal of these countries is understandable. They wanted political reform. They wanted an end to the repression. They wanted more freedom. They wanted democracy. And this happened in country after country in the Middle East. And as I said, they began very non-violently. People by the hundreds of thousands, even the millions, gathered in non-violent protest. And that is a very powerful tool to have if you want to bring about change. There's a collective voice of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of people that are all chanting the same thing. And though I've never been to one, I can imagine the energy that would be created from a protest such as that. I can imagine a wave of energy that encapsulates everyone and everything, and how you would think you're on the verge of getting what you want. I mean, I've been, and that's a poor example, but I've been at, hockey games where you get, the power of that crowd cheering and chanting. And that's only, 17,000 people at the Saddledome. Imagine being in a town square with a 500,000 people cheering and chanting. Imagine the energy and power that would come from that. More pictures of the nonviolent protest. It almost was a bit of a celebratory mood. I mean, you see fireworks here, um, a bit of an occupation, occupying their own section of the city. Um, Almost a celebratory mood. They probably thought they were on the verge of getting what they wanted. The way the governments cracked down on them was they didn't roll in there with the military and try and shoot them all. I mean, you can't do that as a government. This is the era of the media and TV. If you start killing the protesters or even arresting them en masse, it looks bad. It makes your government lose credibility. Any government, um, all it wants, it wants a lot of things, but any oppressive dictatorship, any regime wants credibility. It wants to appear legitimate to other countries on Earth. I mean, after all, it has to work with them. No country's an island. So even a regime like North Korea wants to appear credible. It wants to appear legitimate. And if you roll in there with tanks and tear gas and you shoot them all, you lose all semblance of credibility and legitimacy. But what they did do was rather than roll into the middle and arrest them, they began to pull people from the periphery. They picked people off on the perimeter and they arrested and detained those people. It was by and large done off camera. Most people didn't even know they had gone missing. Um, that was the tactic by a lot of the governments that were trying to respond to the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring. And as I said, some of them did turn violent. Sadly, some of them became violent. A lot of people died and will die um, during the Arab awakening. And it doesn't have at least an immediate romantic end to it. I mean, when we think about revolutions and we see movies about revolutions, they always end with success, but that's Hollywood. By and large, most revolutions end in failure, at least in the immediate future. There may be lasting and staying power long term, but as we're witnessing during the Arab awakening, very few countries have actually been able to get their democratic reforms. Very few have led to long-term stable democracies. It's going to take time. It's probably going to take decades. Ironically enough, the people conducting the revolution, the awakening, the nonviolent protest, um, they may not get it during their lifetime. They might be protesting, in some cases, even fighting for something that they won't be alive to see. Maybe it's for their kids. Maybe it's for their grandkids. So there needs to be a long view, a long-term vision on this kind of change. I thought I'd quickly talk about the Hong Kong protests. They've been in the news a lot over the past year. Hong Kong had originally, until 1997, been a British colony. So, of course, as it was a British colony, it was a democracy and it had democratic freedoms. Of course it does. While the rest of China, as you know, was a dictatorship. And so Hong Kong had always had its own separate legal system, separate from China. They had freedom of assembly, they had freedom of speech. But in June of 1919, um, China began to assert more control over Hong Kong. The long-term goal being, China wants to control Hong Kong. Hong Kong is very wealthy. China's already always looked at Hong Kong as part of China, and they might have been right about that part. And so anyway, the protests started over Chinese government plans to allow extradition from Hong Kong to mainland China. In other words, people that break the law in Hong Kong would be tried and convicted in China. In other words, they're taking you from a democracy, putting you on trial in a dictatorship, and punishing you in the dictatorship. It wouldn't have a good end for obvious reasons, and so Hong Kong began to protest that. Uh, the demonstrations have continued. China has continued to crack down on their control over Hong Kong. While the protests did begin non-violently, they're becoming more and more violent. It actually looks like Hong Kong won't be able to stand up to China. I mean, how could they really? China's way bigger, way more powerful, but at least they're trying. But it doesn't look good for Hong Kong. It looks like, as much as they're protesting non-violently, and violently, they're probably gonna lose to China. Um, so that's too bad. That's too bad. Well, that's our look at nonviolent protest. Here are some key points that I want you to consider and at least think about. Nonviolent protest can be very, very, very effective, but there are some guidelines that you'd want to be aware of. It needs to be inspired. And what I mean by nonviolent protest being inspired is that I think and this is just me talking here, it needs to come from the heart. It needs to be a cause that you truly believe in and you want to stand up for. It can't be something that is artificial, something that you're forced to do, something that you're paid to do. A lot of protesters, you'd be surprised to know, especially protesters that are protesting things like the pipeline, they're actually professional protesters. They're hired by governments and organizations to protest. Um, and that's not inspired protest. That's professional protester. I'm not sure their heart is really in it. And how effective could it be if your heart's not in it and you're not inspired because you think it's the right thing? So protest needs to come from within, at least according to me. It needs to be informed, And what I mean by that is that the last thing you'd want to do is conduct a protest that was based on misinformation. Maybe you're protesting the wrong thing. So any protest needs to be informed. It needs to be aware. I mean, what you're advocating for has to be the truth. It has to be backed up by facts and evidence. Um, Otherwise, how effective could it really be? And if you conduct an uninformed protest and you're protesting the wrong thing, what if you get what you want? What if the government changes things based on your misinformation? You're actually doing a disservice to your country, your society. Needs to be clear. And what I mean by that is that I'm thinking about the 3.5% rule, of course, advocated by Chenoweth. We learned about that last week, in that what protesters want needs to be clear, it needs to be direct, because a protest is trying to bring about political change, but you're also trying to get other people to join your movement. And if your protest is clear and direct, you can inspire more people to join your movement and get to that 3.5% rule that Chenoweth is advocating for. Needs to be clear, needs to be direct. Probably the simpler the better. And you don't want protests to become, what's the word I'm looking for, bogged down um, by a series of other things. In other words, if you're protesting one thing, you don't want to amalgamate your protest with three other protests, because then it loses its clarity, it's no longer direct, and people don't really even know what you're protesting for. Protests need to communicate. In other words, you're trying to get media attention, so your protest needs to be conducted in a way that will generate media attention, will get people's attention, maybe even get them to join the cause, because you're trying to advocate for change. You're trying to get as many people as you can to support your cause, so the government can no longer ignore that movement. It can't ignore that group of people. Otherwise, it's not going to get reelected or elected in the first place. So things like social media, etc., part of communication. Key item, it needs to be peaceful. As we've learned, protest needs to be non-violent, because once it turns violent, you lose sympathy. Uh, you don't get to your 3.5%. Needs to stay peaceful. And finally, nonviolent protest needs to remain patient. As we've talked about, you're probably not leaving the protest getting what you wanted, and you probably won't get it within a week, months, and sometimes even years. But that doesn't mean that you still shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that the cause still isn't important, knowing that you may never get what you want. It doesn't mean that you still shouldn't try in the first place. And I'm not telling you to go out and protest. I'm not advocating for that at all. I don't want that. I'm just saying that, um, as part of social studies and being a citizen, there is that right to nonviolent protest, but there are some guidelines that, people would probably want to think about that make nonviolent protest more effective. Well, I guess that's the end of the course. I have nothing left to teach you. We did really well. Geez, we nearly finished. If I had one more week, I could have finished off this course. If I had one more week of time, we could have been done right to the very end. I didn't cut many corners. We missed a couple of things. We didn't talk a whole lot about democratization. We didn't spend a whole lot of time on revisionist history. There's a couple of things in there that if I had one more week, we could have finished off. I think we did very well. Like we just I'm proud of what we did. I'm proud of how far we went given the circumstances. I think what helped us a lot was we had such a big head start. When they shut us down May 13th, we were already ahead of the game. That's why we were watching The Big Short. We were ahead of the game, and uh, and then ironically enough, we never got to finish The Big Short because we had the school shut down. But you should be proud for coming this far under the circumstances. I'm very proud of all the work you've done. I'm very proud of all that you've learned. It's been a real treat to teach you. I've never connected with a group of kids like I connected with your class. I don't know what it was, but I just knew driving into work that I was going to have a good day, that it was going to be a good class. Um, you brought out the best in me. You made me want to be a better teacher. You made me want to work harder because you were getting something out of it all. I'll never forget that. you made me better, and you really inspired me. So I guess good luck. Um, I'll always be proud to have been your teacher. I'll be proud to say that I was your teacher. Good luck to you. I really wish things could have ended on a better note, but that's life. I think that things happen for a reason, and that reason won't always show itself right away. Sometimes it takes time to know why something happened, and one day we'll know why this happened. But anyway, it's been a pleasure, a treat, and I guess I'll say goodbye.